Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream! Scream for your lives!
Hey up, weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cuppa. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today is hoping that you choke on him! Choke on him!
Hello, how are you?
I'm all right. I've hurt my throat now. I've choked on him. I'm all right. How you doing? I should say my guest today is James Rose.
Hello.
I completely messed up the introduction there. I had one job to introduce you, and I didn't because I was busy doing me Day of the Dead impression.
It was worth it. It was worth it. It was a good impression. I thought I was watching that bit of the film again.
Yeah. How are you, James? How you doing?
I'm okay. I'm all good. I'm busy doing bits and pieces, and it's always good to take a break and have the opportunity to watch a film from the past and to talk about it. It's been, again, like with The Thing, it was just great to have a reason to watch the film and watch it just for the sheer pleasure of watching it. And as with The Thing, as I said in the last time I was here, that despite its age and despite seeing it numerous times, it still stands up, and it's an incredibly good film, and incredibly bleak as well, as no doubt we'll discuss.
I'm going to say it now. I know it's kind of sacrilege, but this is my favourite of the trilogy, the original.
I knew this
trilogy.
was coming. I knew it was coming because we mentioned when we talked about The Thing how we appreciated Halloween but couldn't quite see it in the dimensions that it's perceived in. And I was thinking about that when I was watching Day of the Dead, because I think for me, like you, Day of the Dead's the best one out of all of them. And that's not to discredit Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead, but I just think everything crystallized and everything found itself in Day of the Dead better than in the other two. But the other two had to happen for Day of the Dead to occur. And it's interesting. I remember in the last time we talked, I mentioned my neighbour, Dan, and I bumped into him and said, oh, I'm going to be doing Day of the Dead. And we ended up talking about this very thing. And he was saying about how when we're introduced to films after they've been released and all the myths occurred around them, we're told to like it. We're told this is a good film. This means this, and this means that. And that clouds perhaps the way in which we then perceive it. So I was told before I first watched Halloween, for example, that it was groundbreaking and that it was, it's triggered all of these films. And then I just went along with that narrative. Now I'm much older. I'm kind of like, no. And it's the same with Day of the Dead. It didn't do very well when it was released. It got a lot of criticism. And then I'm watching it and just thinking, no, this is brilliant. It's got subtext if you want to enjoy it. It's got strong characters if you want to enjoy it that way. But it's also just an incredibly outrageously violent and incredibly gory film, which, again, is another thing that certain audience members might want to watch. They might want to enjoy those moments. So I kind of agree with you and Dan that I think it's a brilliant film, and I'm not buying into the mythologies of the other two. They're great, but I can't quite see how important they are when you put it against Dawn of the Dead.
Well,
Day of the Dead.
I don't get me wrong. Night of the Living Dead is still one of my favorite films. I love that film. There's something so eerie about that film, and it was, and I think the Night of the Living Dead, it was incredibly low budget. It was because Romero he wasn't one of your kind of Spielberg, George Lucas types who did the whole film school thing and ended up working with Roger Corman and all that stuff. He completely did it on his own. He was proper indie. He set up his own production company, and Night of the Living Dead kind of came out from that, and I think there's something, but I think with Night of the Living, because it's kind of like that black and white, the shaky camera, all of these kind of the social commentary that's in there, the sort of race thing, and all that kind of stuff, and it is very, whether Romero denies it or not, it is political. If you put a black
Yeah.
guy in a situation like that at that time, in the middle of the civil rights movement and the riots and all that, it's political.
Mm.
But also, I think Night of the Living Dead works because it's not to take anything else away from it, not to take any of those things I've just mentioned away from it, but it's kind of shock value. People had not seen anything like
Mm.
you'd had, obviously, we can go into sort of zombie history in a minute, but you'd had zombie films and you'd had little glimpses of what a zombie film could be, The Last Man on Earth and things like this, Plague of the Zombies, Hammer's Plague of the Zombies. But this was complete shock value, and it's the first time we'd seen, zombies like that chewing on human flesh and all this kind of stuff, and it feels very real. And there's something very sort of cinema verite about it. So it was complete shock value. And obviously, Dawn of the Dead comes later on, and rather than it being a kind of direct, follow-on sequel as such, even though it is, it's a film which is, very famously a deconstruction of American consumerism and the zombies as blind consumers, all of that kind of stuff. So the first film's shock value, the second film is satire, because it's not just social commentary, it is satire, and it is black comedy. And you can't help but, there is literally a custard pie fight in Dawn of the Dead. So it's brilliant, and both of those films are great. I love Night of the Living Dead, I really like Dawn of the Dead, but Day of the Dead, which we'll get into, it's just like you said, it's bleak. And it's the first of the trilogy. I saw it for the first time. That's the first one I saw. And then I went back and saw Dawn, and then I saw Night of the Living Dead later on. But that was the first one I saw. And the first Romero film I saw, I remember seeing it when it was on BBC Two when I was like 10 or 11 or whatever, was Martin.
Mm.
And in many ways, that's my favorite Romero film. There's something
Mm.
very odd about that film. But yeah, Day of the Dead, which we'll get into, is just, it's bleak, it's Cold War, it's Reagan era paranoia. It's you in so there are many scenes in Dawn of the Dead where before it all kicks off, it's kind of like, this is all right. They've got, it's not bad. They've got their own little shopping mall, and they can go around the shops and do this and drink beer and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, I wouldn't mind doing that for a bit. I'm not signing up to Day of the Dead. That looks horrendous. You know, you're not until the only daylight you get is when you're out actively being chased by zombies, and then when you go underground, you're having to be bossed around by fucking these army cunts. Just like
It's grim.
it is.
But I think that's the whole part of it, isn't it? It's probably something we'll discuss, is that there is a steady ratcheting up of the grimness in that trilogy. And I think that the first, like you said, the first one's just bang and it's happening. And I think watching it again, one of the things that I really appreciated about Day of the Dead is that Logan, the crazed scientist, even comments on it when he's reducing roads to nothing through common sense. And he just basically says, you haven't got enough bullets, and we should have really shot them all right at the beginning. And his solution's accurate. It should have happened. But we've seen what happens when you get shot at the beginning of these things, and that outcome isn't the best outcome. And those two reference points, you just kind of think, this is really bleak. Even if they had shot all of the notional zombies in the beginning, who else would have got shot during that time? What society would have come out of that process? So I think it is bleak on so many different levels, and I find it a bit frustrating that we say, "Oh, it's depressing." I'm not sure it's depressing. I think it's bleak. I think it confronts us with what we might do in a situation where humanity or civilization is genuinely on the brink of extinction, and it's challenging in that way.
But this is why it's such a great Cold War film,
Mm,
because, it came out in 85. I probably saw it about 86. I saw it on video in 86 or whatever. And I think it's a Cold War film because it would have been made in 84. So, in 84, 85, it's probably, the 80s kids, for those that you weren't there. This is the other thing. It's like, it's pretty grim. It's kind of the 80s been reduced to a fancy dress costume, if you like. It's Madonna, it's big shoulders, it's this and it's this and it's this and all this weird and wonderful, brilliant pop music. And it's all of those things. But it's also growing up in the 80s. My dad was a miner, so he went through all the miners' strike. But at the same
mm,
time, you're going through life, despite the fact that I was massively into comics and rock and roll and Alice Cooper and all of this kind of stuff, which was kind of trying to keep me sort of distracted. The bottom line, I and a lot of kids like me were convinced that we were all going to die on the same day,
mm,
i.e., through a nuclear war, because that's all you were it was
mm.
almost like you were trained up.
Yeah.
That's what's going to happen. And it was a really, and I know it sounds like I'm overreacting, but that's really it.
Oh
It
no,
was
that's how I
always at the
remember.
back of your mind,
Yeah.
always at the back of your mind.
It was the other narrative, wasn't it, in your life? It was you had your family life, you had your friends within that life, you had school, which broached those two things, or college, which broached those two things. But then there's the other narrative, which was the one that was happening at 9 o'clock at night on your TV or 10 o'clock at night on your TV, and that was the real world. And that sort of, I remember it sort of leaching in to my those two other lives in sort of like power cuts, things like that. The miners' strike. My grandfather was a miner, so all of that was a topic of discussion in my family. Watching that on the news, watching Scargill get hit by the police officer, the mounted police officer, seeing all of those images on a daily basis, and then seeing on the news what's going on in America. Because, like you said, 84, 85 was the middle really of Reagan's sort of presidency, and we're sort of seeing that coming through. And I think it's got to kind of be said he believed in power, didn't he? He believed in military might, but he also brokered a lot of good anti-nuclear deals, particularly with Gorbachev. But that comes near the end. So at the time period in which the film came out, was made in and released, and that we're experiencing it. 'Cause like you, I think my first experience of seeing it was on VHS, hired from the local video shop. And you either saw the news before you watched it, or you saw the news after you watched it, and it was, you know, they're in a nuclear bunker.
Yeah,
They're
yeah,
not in some random,
yeah.
silo. They're in a nuclear bunker.
No,
And I've just
because that's
watched
what he
that
said. They
film.
reference that.
Yeah.
They never say the word nuclear because
Mm.
obviously that world is gone now.
Yeah.
But but when we get Flyboy,
Mm.
he's talking about this. He's saying, you know what they've got down here? And he's like saying, oh, they've got, a
Mm.
negative of every film you could watch, and they've got all this and all this kind of stuff that they've kept there and all these pieces of art. And it's like, yeah, that's a nuclear bunker. Because one of the most
Mm.
depressing, I mean, I'm sure you've seen Threads, but Threads was
Yeah.
something and that film, very famously, but that film is traumatic.
Yeah.
And it traumatized me. I saw Threads for the first time when I was 14, and
Mm.
it was kind of this fascination, but also it absolutely destroyed me. And
Yeah.
and there are many scenes within Threads that are incredibly traumatic and depressing and horrible and harrowing. But one of the lasting images I have that is when you've got like I think it's meant to be like the National Portrait Gallery or something, and they're just taking all these. No, no, it can't be because it's Sheffield, isn't it? So
Yeah.
wherever it is, there are these important works of art, and they're just kind of taking them off the walls and putting them into storage, and it's just like fuck. This is definitely happening, isn't it? And it's like, oh man, you know. But Threads is something, I was forced to watch as a 14-year-old
Mm.
in assembly. And, I was just always like, and the thing is, they showed it in that, that these kind of classes you used to get at school where it's like all about health and social care and all that.
Mhm.
Take better think about, if you're gonna have sex, use a condom. Make sure you're being hygienic and looking after yourself and all this kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, all right, I get that. I can do something about that. What the hell do you think I can do about
Yeah.
impending nuclear holocaust, other than
Mm.
let me enjoy what time I've got left? Don't remind me that this shit. I always remember, and this is no word of a lie. The English teacher showed it to us in this class and it finished, and everybody's just sitting there with their mouths open wide, like, what the fuck have we just watched? And my English teacher, the darling that he was, said, well, I think they were being a bit optimistic. It's like, what? What have you just watched?
I think but that is another sort of cultural moment, is it? Threads, and then either side of it, you've got Peter Watkins's War Games and
Yes.
When the Wind Blows, and they're sort of like an unintentional trilogy of truth, aren't they? Really, and I think when you watch them, I think part of their horror, and perhaps part of the horror of Day of the Dead as well, is that it's recognizable. It's like you said, it's Sheffield. And When the Wind Blows is a recognizable British pastoral that gets literally wiped out. It is, we see it literally get wiped off the face of the earth. And it's horrific, absolutely horrific. And then because perhaps Romero's aware that we've all got that, at least one section of the audience has got that cultural awareness of what a nuclear attack would look like and what the Holocaust after it would look like. That's why when we're in that bunker, we can connect with it. We know it's a nuclear bunker. We know up above is a metaphor for that, potentially a metaphor for that. And how we survive after that, it's played out in a completely different way, because obviously in Threads, society just collapses and reforms itself in a very, very peculiar way. In When the Wind Blows, no one survives. Everyone dies. And we're just left with this rot. Whereas in Day of the Dead, all we can seem to manage is lose it badly and argue a lot with no no real solution. Perhaps there isn't a solution. Perhaps even flying away to the beach at the end, is that a solution? Is that an
Well,
ending?
it feels like a temporary solution, and
Mm.
it's just, again, it's just kicking the can down the road, you suspect.
Mm.
But I think that, probably, um, John, what else are you going to do in that situation? Let's enjoy this time we've got
Yeah,
left, and
yeah.
let's sit in the sun. Leave the soldiers to get on with whatever, and let's just go. And it is. But yeah, I mean, the fact I think it's eerie because the threat of nuclear war, or the fear of nuclear war, is such a massive subtext in this film.
Mm.
And it's kind of like, and also what it's the subtext is also about, well, even if you did survive and you had all this stuff, you had enough food to last you, and you had a bunker and you were safe from the radiation, is it worth fucking surviving if all
That's
that's
what War
left is
Games
this?
suggest, isn't it? Yeah, that's what Watkins's War Games
Yeah.
suggests. And I think those closing images of When the Wind Blows also suggest that they just sort of say, there's nothing. It's just literally been wiped off the face of the earth. And I suppose, I mean, it's much later, but those images are echoed in a much stronger way in Terminator 2, which, for all intents and purposes, if we're going to be honest, is a little bit of a jolly runaround with, robots from the future beating each other and this. Then you get this one moment where the human, the mother, the one who, reproduction, looking after the earth, all those sort of things, those sort of very sort of stereotypical metaphors, she talks about wholesale destruction, and we see it, and it's doesn't she at a children's play park,
Yes,
and
yes.
she's holding on to the railings, isn't she? And she literally disintegrates, and it's just America's wiped off the face of the earth, and that resonates again. Even watching Day of the Dead a couple of nights ago, those images are always seem to be at the back of that film. They're like they're the background. I can't quite articulate it, but they're the background of what those people have experienced, even though it's, as you said, it's just zombies and not nuclear weapons.
But I think that's interesting. In general terms, I'm not obviously people deal with things individually, so I don't want to suggest the whole
Mhm.
country's exactly the same or anything like that. But I think it's interesting the way that American films and cinema dealt with that kind of nuclear threat or this fear, this paranoia. Um, in that, with something like Watkins's The War Game, it's very it's even won um an award for the best documentary, even though it's not a documentary, but it's so documentary like, and it's so matter of fact and terrifying. And Threads is a similar sort of thing, but it does something slightly different. Um, I think in America, their equivalent to Threads, The Day After, is
Mm.
very light. I'm not saying it's not grim, but it's not Threads. You can watch
Mhm.
the day after you've seen Threads to cheer yourself up. It's that kind of thing. But whereas I think, and again, this is what I always bang on about. This is why horror films are really interesting, because they can creep in, or science fiction
Mm.
films. So something like Terminator 2, I'm not saying it's again, I'm not saying it's as bleak as Threads, but you have these moments within it that you've just been talking about, which lean into that in a more um, in a more threatening way than something like Day After. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of those films, this is an example of that. It's really tapping into that paranoia, that dread, that fear that was just so prevalent at that time. And it's
Mhm.
hard to explain. I mean, obviously, the world is, in theory, even less safe now than it was then, but it felt more palpable then. It felt like this is going to happen. And I think that and that is whether you're intending to make a simple science fiction film or an escapist horror film, that cannot happen within a vacuum. And all of that fear and all that paranoia and all that dread is creeping in at the edges. And I think that's prevalent in a lot of
Yeah.
80s horror films. You could also you could even, we talked about the thing last time. It's this, it's a similar thing. It literally is like a nuclear
Yeah.
winter of the survivors in a
Yeah.
bunker, and there is this other thing. It's very, it's just there constantly, I think, in the 80s.
I thought literally this morning when I was walking the dog how The Thing and Day of the Dead are almost the same. It's a small group of people locked away in ostensibly a civilian slash science slash military installation, and they are threatened by something that is apocalyptic. And for the most part, all they can do is argue. They can't. Sarah says it twice in Day of the Dead. The solution isn't looking for cures, it's getting on. It's accepting the situation and cooperating with each other and giving as much as you're taking. And no one does that. No one is capable of that. Because one of the things that I wrote down was that every single character in Day of the Dead has lost it. They
Yeah.
have completely and totally and utterly lost it. There isn't one character. I'm not sure there's one character in there who isn't broken down from what's happened. Because I saw, oh, everyone seems to think Sarah's pretty on the ball, but she's not. She keeps using cataloging, calendars, dates, paperwork as a crutch to support what's the tattered remains of her understanding of society. She has a go at Rickles for not updating the chart of how many zombies they've taken out of the corral. To him, it's pointless because there are billions.
Yeah.
There's really billions of them. We don't need to worry about it. But Sarah's like, no, we need to tick them off.
How many zombies are there out there? Well, the answer is too fucking many.
It's
That's
too many. And but then she keeps going on about the calendar. She keeps banging on about paperwork, and it is this kind of like almost insistence of talking about paperwork because if there's no paperwork, there's no society.
yeah.
And it's the same with Logan. If there isn't stability, there's no society. And Rhodes, if there's no violence, there's no control in that society. So they all seem to be just I can't quite just broken down. There's no way of comprehending anymore what's happened to them.
It's a grimmer version of the war room scenes in Kubrick's, Doctor
Yeah,
Strangelove.
yeah,
It's this idea that they think they can survive this. They think that they can. There is this tunnel they can build underneath, and this is how. And it's just nonsense. It's just mental, and it's like, and all these people. Sarah is just, even though outwardly she seems to be the person, if we were there, we probably spend time with her because she seems
yeah,
fairly sensible, but she still lost it, as you
yeah,
said. And Logan has common sense in one aspect, but then he's mental.
yeah.
He's gone. He's absolutely
Absolutely.
gone, and but also the other thing is like the soldiers who we hate because they're an obvious kind of, again, it's very sort of prescient now. They seem like Trump supporter types, but it's like we don't know their backgrounds. They could have had their whole families wiped out, and this is
Yeah,
what they were reduced to, So I think it's really interesting that we don't get these backgrounds, but we can almost imagine that this disparate group of people, where they came from and what they've been through to get there, and what do they deal with. They're dealing with a literal impossible situation.
yeah,
how how is your mindset gonna cope with that? And the answer is it
yeah,
can't.
Now, George A. Romero takes us out of the night, beyond the dawn, and into the darkest day of horror the world has ever known. Day of the Dead.
Yeah, so we talked about the various characters there, and I think it'd be quite good to drill down into, we talked about, because I don't think, like I said, we don't really know what their backgrounds are, and that's one of the great things about this film. I think we don't know. It's similar to the thing, we almost kind of introduce them by their ranks and their jobs. They are known. That's all. That's how they are known to us, and I think it's similar with this. But as you said, each character is absolutely, um, you know, we're well past PTSD. This is they have lost it, and
yeah.
they are dealing with it in ways, the only ways which they know how. Logan, aka Frankenstein, is he's akin to me of, um I don't know if you ever listened to the War of the Worlds album, the
Mm,
musical. Now in that, it's brilliant, and in that you've got this character who's convinced that he can, right, he's just decided that the Martians, like, we're fucked, the Martians have taken over, but he's convinced himself he's going to build a new city underneath the
mhm,
Martians, and he's got these fantasies of this kind of new, super sort of sci-fi new situation. And it's clearly, and when the protagonist character meets him, he's talking about all these plans, and he shows him, that he started digging this tunnel, and it's taken him like a week or whatever to dig like 5 feet, and it's like he's clearly has no understanding of this, and he's got no understanding of how you build that infrastructure. And it's almost like, I feel like that's Logan. He's kind of like he's baked, isn't he? He's absolutely gone. And
Mm.
so he has these kind of scientific credentials. And if we were, if you had more time and you had a situation, yes, some of his experiments are still fairly questionable, but it's also, why are you doing this? And this is what Sarah's saying.
Mm.
It's like, what would look, we're done. We're done. And I think
Mm.
in some ways, John Flyboy is, even though it's sort of a cop out, and like I said, it's kind of like, well, he sees it for what it is. Maybe, he relates it to God, God, there
Mm.
is quasi-religious kind of inferences, but at the end of the day, it's kind of like, well, we've had our shot. That's us. We're done.
He says about why don't we run away and try and start society again, and implies that if that happens, that society is never ever going
Yeah.
back to that bunker.
Yeah.
It's never going back to that old world. And he kind of, I'm not sure he's convinced. I think he's just convinced himself that it's, as you said earlier, why don't we just go and enjoy enjoy the end of days? Because it's, we don't, there is no, there are no other survivors. And that's repeatedly kind of reinforced throughout the film. They're flying hundreds of miles up and down the coast. No one's there. No one's picking up the radio signals. It would seem that they are, from what we're told in the film at least, they're the sole survivors of this. And why not go to a beach and sit in the sun and enjoy the end of days? But it's not quite the end of days, is it? Because Sarah gets out her homemade calendar and starts crossing off the days again. And it's like, oh, okay, perhaps John's plan might not go according to plan because Sarah's there and she still wants that old society, that old world. Perhaps she's still hanging on to it. I don't know. I think it's a bit of an ambiguous ending, really.
Well,
I mean,
I think it's ambiguous in other ways. I don't want to be that guy who does this for every film, but I think, because obviously we're presented with that horrific ending and then it's a
yeah,
nightmare and she wakes up, but it's like, but is that though? Is that the ending? Is this the
yeah,
fantasy that we
yeah.
want?
That's a number of things that I've read around the film would suggest that she's dead. She has, she's been attacked. She's been chewed up. She's been bitten. And what we see is her thinking as either she's been eaten, she's succumbing to the infection, whatever that may be, or it's her dying moments. But I don't know. It's such a clumsy way to end that film. To have such a, seems a bit cheap to have all of these zombies appear and then she suddenly wakes up. But she keeps waking up throughout the film,
Yeah,
doesn't she? She
yeah,
begins the film asleep and wakes up, and then she dreams again, and then she dreams again. And it's sort of, we're being set up to accept that ending that she dreams. But it's not a dream, is it? It can't, the whole of their film can't be a dream. It's got to be real. And she can't just be on the beach. But time has passed because all of, in the first dream, the calendar is October and all the days are crossed off. And when she wakes up on the beach, it's November the 4th or 5th, I think.
yeah.
Time has passed and it doesn't add up, I don't think, whichever way you look at it. It's almost like I wanted to end it with them all getting munched. And that would have been, would have been great. I
Which
haven't
is
got a problem
which is
with that.
what would have happened realistically, it's just
Yeah.
and but also I think, the other character that we've not really talked about, who, because he's kind of, he is a character but he's not really a character, is Bob. And I think that is a
Hmm.
interesting, you know, obviously it's a kind of shift in the paradigm because it's Romero introducing this idea that maybe they are evolving, or maybe that's our fantasy. Maybe we
Yeah.
want them to think they're evolving,
Mhm.
because that makes us feel better. I don't know. But Bob, you've got this dichotomy. So you've got Frankenstein and creation, if you like. It is that relationship,
Yeah,
whatever this guy has been before he was bitten, he is now this thing. And, and it is very much Frankenstein. Logan is he's he's for all his common sense, he's also quite nostalgic. And he's kind of, he's seeing Bub as
yeah,
this thing, he's putting these phones and this all this kind of like this 20th century accoutrements on the table in front of him. He's obsessed with that. And Bub is a kind of a reflection of that. Bub is a reminder of the past. And also, but the dichotomy is
yeah,
that all the characters really, Bub is kind of like a he's the most obvious representation of that, but all the characters are locked in the past, and that past has gone. And John is the only one who's really
mm,
understood that. And even though mankind, over centuries, we may have created some of the best art, best films, best literature, or whatever, John is the only one that's saying, look, we've got to get rid of it all. It doesn't matter. Leave all this
yeah.
shit here because if you take one bit, you take everything. And we can't afford to do this again. And we fucked it up, so leave everything behind. Literally, like drop a nuclear bomb on the nuclear bunker because we're not
Bomb.
worth saving. It,
But
it,
that's interesting as well, because the one thing he is fixated on is fuel in the helicopter.
yeah,
And we can read that in a number of ways, in that he makes a big deal of it at the beginning when they come back, and it problematizes the ending again. Because he actually says, as they're running towards the helicopter at the end, let's hope those soldiers filled up the helicopter with fuel. And the reason why they might not have done it is Sarah. Sarah says no at the beginning. Don't fill it with fuel because the zombies are too agitated. You're going to draw more. Wait till night when we can't see them. But then when later in the film we see what those two soldiers are like, they're smoking drugs, they're high as kites, they're drunk, they're rude, they're racist. The chances of them filling the helicopter with fuel is slim. So when they come to run and to go and escape, again, it problematizes what we've just talked about the ending, is that John's also got to take all of those weights that are holding the rotors, the front rotor, the top rotor, sorry, and the back rotor down. Just doesn't make sense. But his perspective on the fuel is it's the only commodity worth having because it means he can escape to the beach. That's all. You're right. Leave everything behind. We just take the fuel because we can feed ourselves because we see him fishing. We can keep ourselves warm because we see a fire on the beach. All of those things. But fuel is the one thing he desires the most. And it might not be in the helicopter to get him where he wants to get to.
but
So it's quite,
also, and again, it's kind of it's overly simplistic to do this in some ways, but I because I was saying to you earlier on, I've just done this kind of film course at the Broadway called The Message in the Movies, like cinema and ideology, and everybody, always points to sort of Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, because there is obvious social commentary. But I think obviously, as we've highlighted, but you forget just how, other than the Cold War paranoia stuff, how prescient it is, and how you know, clearly these guys, they are a representation, the soldiers are a representation of what we've effectively got in the White House now and those kind of supporters. And it's kind of whatever the background is, whatever the reasons for being there, it's nonsensical, not just to other people that they don't like, but to themselves. And it proves the overwhelming political feel of the 21st century if you want to look at it like that. And I'm not just talking about Trump, I'm talking in some respects of this country and other countries, is this bullshit. And it's just this absolute lack of belief. And it's working on platforms of absolute beliefs or absolutes when they believe nothing. And Rhodes is a really good example of that. The reason he's just looking for an excuse to vent his fury on somebody, and it's very much he doesn't care. But if it's happens to be more liberal characters, then all the better. And he's just finding that excuse to do that, even though it makes no sense. It will not help him or his men. He pretends to care about his men. He keeps saying the
Mm.
reason he doesn't like Frankenstein, oh, well, you've used my men. You can't do that to my men. But the moment it all kicks off, he fucks off. He runs
Yeah, he
away,
locks
leaves
the
his
door.
men,
Yeah, he
locks.
locks the door.
Yeah. So it none of it's all based on nothing. You know, probably the best character in some ways, the most realistic character is Bill. He's getting pissed all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah. But even Bill's flawed, isn't he?
Yeah.
Bill's accepted he can't cope, so Bill's drinking his way through the current situation until the drink runs out. And kind of what you're saying about Rhodes, and the same with Bill. Neither of them express a plan for the future. Neither of them. Rhodes never communicates. He wants to be flown away, but to where? And he's already had that plan usurped by Logan. He said it's 400,000 to 1 is the ratio now. So he does. I think he even says to him, "Where would you go? Where are you going to go?" And I don't think Rhodes buys into John's solution because, well, what are they going to do? What what does Rhodes doesn't know what he wants. He just wants to, like you say, vent his anger, and that's his inability of coping coming through, isn't it? I can't cope, so I mean, the bit when he asks Steele to shoot Sarah is horrifying because he means it. He means, but I'm going to amplify it by having somebody else amplify my power by having somebody else do it. And he threatens to shoot Steele, doesn't he? If you don't shoot her, I'll shoot you. And it's just this explosion of rage and explosion of power, but for no real reason. He needs to listen to Sarah, which is if we cooperate, we might, well, we might survive, but as we said earlier, survive for what? And I think perhaps that's really what's going through all of those characters' heads. There's no, what's the purpose in surviving? So I don't know. It's a complicated film, isn't it? Where you start to interrogate it.
You know, yeah, it's far more complex than people give it credit for. And what has always slightly pissed me off a bit is that it is always seen as being the poor relation to
Yeah.
Dawn and Night. And as I've said, I love both those films. Don't get me wrong, but there's something so clever and so this, you know, people always kind of, yeah, I've read kind of critiques from people who were like really good writers, really good horror writers, and they've completely disregarded this film, and I've never understood why. It's so good. It's so it leaves it just builds this tension, and you know, and I think in some ways it's one of the best acted Romero films as well. Even though a lot of these people can't, they went on to do other bits and pieces, but they weren't like big names. But they were brilliant. I mean, you know, Joseph Pilato as Rhodes is just brilliant.
Brilliant.
It's so on point. It's so fantastically just boiling over with fury, and he doesn't know why. It's just like he's gonna, you know, he will absolutely cut his nose off to spite his face because that's his character, and his men are just kind of doofuses, really. You know, they are repellent in many ways by our standards, but who knows how would we respond to that situation? And it's all very well thinking, yeah, we'd be Sarah or John. It's like, you don't know what you'd be like. I think the other cat again, another character we've not mentioned yet is Miguel. Now, I would say, even though I've just said I think it's the best acted, I would say he's the weak link. Personally, and I'm not saying it destroys the film, and I'm not attacking the guy personally or anything like that. I've got nothing against him, but I don't know. I don't buy the relationship between him and Sarah. If I'm being, you know,
for me, is that he's accepted he's broken. He's almost like a voice of reason, and his performance sort of communicates this complete, like, I've got stressed,
Yeah.
I've broken, and now I've come out of being broken, and there is nothing left. And I think that's why that performance is so, it's very drained, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's very contained. And I think his criticisms of Sarah are really interesting
Yeah.
because he keeps saying to her, everybody, including yourself, thinks you're strong, but you're not. You're just as broken as everyone else. And he almost suggests that if you get to this point with me, perhaps you'll be happier. I know that sounds odd, but perhaps you'll be able to see this differently and perceive things differently. And perhaps John has done that as well. There's nothing
I,
I can do.
I think Miguel the character's interesting, but I'm not convinced by that performance. And again, it doesn't ruin the film. It's not a deal breaker or anything like that. I think if I just had to pick certain, if I had to critique it in one way, I think that would be it. But yeah, certainly as a character, again, we would probably be more like Miguel if we're being honest. And also, I think that character, without saying anything, with it's all show and no tell, um, which is great. I think it paints the world for us. Clearly, I would argue that clearly Miguel is not a soldier, but he's been
Mm,
drafted in at some point.
yeah.
But he's got no other skills, so he's a grunt basically. They've drafted him in, and he's not up to the job. You can imagine that Steele and Rickles are kind of they are possibly part-time kind of Southern Comfort type
Yeah.
soldiers, and he will get a kick out of it, but he's not in the headspace. You can imagine him at a poetry reading or something, but he shouldn't be front line in a war. But I think, as horrible as Rhodes is, I mean, as I said, it's a great performance, but that character, there is an honesty, there is a rawness and honesty about that character, which is incredibly believable. And the famous line, this is a war, people. It's just, well, yes, it is.
Mm,
And Sarah can do as many crossings off of her
yeah.
dates and calendars and her forms and whatever. He understands that. What he's going to do about it is questionable, but at least he understands that. Whereas Logan's faffing about with his experiments and wasting
Mm.
everybody's time and
But
feeding.
that's what Rose keeps saying, doesn't it? Rose keeps saying, I want results. And he's almost sort of saying, almost constantly, I need something to believe in. And the only people I can believe in at this point are now you. And you're using up all my resources. You're literally feeding my men to fuel experiments that are meaningless. Sarah says it, doesn't she? These are proving things that we knew months ago. And Rhodes just wants something to give him hope, but also to prevent him from shooting those people. Because, I mean, he basically says it, doesn't he? The only person he needs is John. That's the only person he
Yeah.
needs. Then John becomes expendable if they reach some position of safety. He doesn't need any of them. I mean, ultimately, he doesn't need Rickles. He doesn't need Steele. And that's probably why he locks them in that space with the sort of like the tide of zombies, partly to slow everything down, but partly to save himself. But he doesn't need anyone. Just needs John at that point to get him out of that silo, that bunker.
And I think that, we've got this standoff between Logan and Sarah and the soldiers and Rhodes in particular. But I think, like you said, it's kind of like his initially, I think his anger, his outbursts, it is that kind of, well, he can talk about resources and this and this and this, but ultimately it boils down to, why haven't you saved us yet?
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
The people who are meant to have saved us.
yeah, and it is just, where's the cavalry? In other words, and that's not coming, and the savior is not coming, and this is it, and that's a terrifying concept.
But I was kind of thinking when you were talking about Rickles and Steele there, Rickles and Steele are kind of like the boys in the posse from Night of the Living Dead. They almost perceive it as an enjoyable experience. Rickles in particular, he's absolutely unhinged. When I watched it a few nights ago, his performance initially really annoyed me. It was just loud and silly and aggressive. But that's Rickles. He's completely, totally, and utterly gone. And all he can do now is just be mad, just be absolutely insane. And he's sort of the sidekick to Steele, isn't he? Steele is a bit more grounded, but both of them, like Rhodes, just believe in the power of the gun. The
But Steele's
endless
laugh,
bullets.
Steele's laugh tells you everything you need
Yeah.
to know about this situation. That's not a genuine, that's not a kind of hearty laugh. That's someone
Yeah.
who's absolutely their mechanism's gone.
Yeah. But he's hanging on a little bit, isn't he? To like Sarah hangs on to her calendars and her charts and crossing thing off. Steele hangs on to procedure and process. So when they're in the corral, he's ordering people around, he's insisting on procedure. And it's not just for safety, it's some semblance of control in a situation that is drastically out of control. And perhaps that's what I've been trying to sort of say all along, is that it's desperate control against massive uncontrol. And all they've got between them really is that wooden barrier in the corral. And that's not even not particularly strong, is it, given the light of what happens? I think the other thing we've not talked about, and we're sort of skirting around, is the excessive amount of gore that is in it.
I was just going to say, I mean, yeah, this is whatever anyone else thinks about this film. Like I've said, I think it's my favorite of the trilogy, original trilogy. But regardless of your own personal thoughts, graphically, this is much better, much more. As much, and again, I'm not taking anything away from Dawn and Night. This is Savini at his peak.
Yeah,
This
it's
is,
top
I mean,
tier, really, isn't it? It is absolutely top tier.
because you've got in Dawn, it was just because there were so many extras. You got, and it was like a production line, and
Mhm.
again, the zombie, very deliberately as well as practically, the zombies were they were kind of over the top, stereotypical versions of typical sort of more American culture, and that's the reason for it, and obviously the satire works. Dead is kind of Night of the Living Dead is kind of very, the zombies are kind of on the periphery, and
Yeah.
we get to see them. They're very shadowy, and it's kind of night, all of that kind of stuff. Whereas here, I think this is the first time we get to see Savini within this franchise really being able to play, and
Yeah.
the results are fantastic. And I also have to say, as well as, so obviously you had Dawn of the Dead, and then the unofficial Italian sequel to Dawn of the Dead was Zombie or Zombie 2, because Dawn of the Dead in Italy, the Argento cut was known as Zombie. So then you had this very cheeky, supposedly a sequel to Dawn of the Dead called Zombie 2, which is better known in our country as Zombie Flesh Eaters. Now, as much as bizarrely, even though that was kind of based on Dawn of the Dead, the continuation of that, I would say that Romero and Savini were much more influenced by zombie flesh eaters when it came to making this film. And even not just because like I said, those Dawn of the Dead zombies were very caricature-esque,
Yeah.
whereas what Lucio Fulci did and his makeup artists was present us with actual living corpses. And they, whatever you think, I love zombie flesh eaters. Spoiler alerts, it's going to be an upcoming episode. But they looked like walking corpses, and they look incredible. And I think that's what we get here, and particularly the opening scenes to Day of the Dead when they're walking around trying to find survivors, and we get to see this desolated, what's left of this city, and the papers are blowing around, and the dead walk the earth, all of this kind of stuff, and the zombie alligator. and you see the guy walking up to the screen with no lower jaw and all
Yeah.
this kind of stuff. It's classic, but it is so zombie flesh eaters. And I think what's interesting, zombie flesh eaters, Romero, the original zombie films, the 30s zombie films were very much about voodoo and
Yeah.
foreign islands, and Romero took us away from that mythology and placed it very much as an urban stroke suburban threat, blue collar, all this kind of stuff. But then what Lucio Fulci does, he takes it back to that mysterious island and
Mm.
these kind of voodoo sort of connections. So I think you get snatches of that in Day of the Dead when they're walking around. That feels very much as if it could almost be a scene from Zombie Flesh Eaters.
Mm.
And I think that the way that the zombies look is much more sort of, it's very sort of Fulci sort of walking corpses, and they feel more threatening in some ways. But also, it's got to be said that the gore, as you say, I mean, there are some fantastic
Mm.
deaths in this. I mean,
But
we've
there's a
already,
bit before it, isn't there, as well? In between that, you've got that fantastic opening with the figure's called, I think, if I remember correctly, Dr. Tong, the one that comes up to the screen with the missing lower
Mm,
jaw. And in the middle of it, we get to see Logan's experiments. And they're when you know how they're done, it's absurdly simple. It's absolutely absurdly simple. But watching them,
mm,
and I think what you kind of hit the nail on the head for me in my response to it is they are realistic. That's what I feel. Even though I know it's cow intestines, even though I know it's prophylactics and it's KY jelly and all the blood and all of that sort of stuff, it doesn't matter. The realism of the film and the realism of that opening and the realism of Logan's laboratory, it's stomach churning to see what is ostensibly just a man lifting himself up off the bed and having something slosh out. But it's the noise, what always strikes me is the density of the color of the blood. It's so deep, it's almost black, and
yeah.
it's just like it's dirty. The whole film's dirty, to be quite honest. It's kind of feels filthy, but it's just amazing. And it makes you think, oh, okay, this is pretty grim. And those deaths at the end are they're funny to a certain extent, but they're also, it's almost like EC comic justice, isn't it? That those zombies have been butchered. So the last ones left are going to be butchered in return. And it's plays off quite nicely with how when John's running through the mine shafts, we don't really see the zombies get killed in a graphic way. They're just shot in the head. That's it. And they disappear. That's it. And we're sort of, it's flipped, isn't it? The zombies are
Yeah.
butchered and the people are just shot. Then at the end, the people are butchered and the zombies are just shot. So the film balances itself out and it sort of communicates itself in that balance. But yeah, those deaths at the ending are just
Well, it's just ingenious. I mean, it takes a sick mind, I think, someone like, I mean, Savini, he was, famously, he was kind of Vietnam photographer,
yeah.
wasn't he? So he's kind of one of his influences. I'd love to talk to Tom Savini. I think he's just a fascinating character, I think,
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, like, yeah, when when the zombies on the slab and he reaches over and his intestines fall out, and it's just the non-reaction. That's what the stomach, quite literally a stomach churning thing, is that all this stuff just splashes on the floor and it's not aware at all.
Yeah.
And also when he's kind of, he's stripped the zombie down to its kind of brainstem and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's brilliant. It's really well done. And and Frankenstein, Logan, towards the end before he gets killed, when he walks in and he's feeding Bub the intestines or whatever it is, or the human parts, and he's just drenched in blood. I mean, at this point, it's like, is anybody not convinced that this man is clearly insane?
It's all part of it, isn't it? In Logan's psychosis of it all. He just sees that as it's normal now. It's got to be this way. If Rhodes wants results, then he's got to give up his men in a different way. And chopping them up and feeding them to Bub is normal in his head. But even when that happens in the middle of the film, when we see Logan's experiments, Sarah's ultimately not that repulsed. She's disgusted, but she kind of gets it. And for Logan, it's just another day at the office. Even drilling the one that stomach falls out, it's just like, bear with me a minute. Casually picks up the drill and just puts it in its head. And you can imagine in Logan's mind, like, oh, that's another sort of experiment that I've now got to redo. It's almost an inconvenience to have to kill that zombie because I've got to start again. They are literally just flesh to him, aren't they? They're not humans. They're not undead. They're not someone who was once living. They're just meat. And that's perhaps how he perceives the dead soldiers that he feeds to Bub. Just meat now. So, but it's a bit grim when we find out the one that's reduced to its brain and sort of spinal column is actually Major Cooper. The one we then get some idea of how mad Logan is, that he's gone off the rails completely. And Sarah's disgust in that scene turns to just a series of pennies dropping that are like, whoa, if Rhodes finds out, we're all dead. It's not just going to be you. We're all going to be killed. So that scene, even though we can celebrate the artistry and the meaning of the horror, it's also got clear resonance in the rest of the film because we're signposted quite early on that Logan is not playing by the rules at all. He's almost on another planet, quite literally, isn't he?
Yeah, and also he's kind of like an over the top bastardized version of it, but he's almost like he's the last remnants of, and Sarah as well to a certain degree, but he's like the last remnants of the world's academia.
Yeah.
And having worked in and around academia, I've met these people. They're not right. You know, it's just this belligerent idea that their research is really important or their thesis is really important. So they spend their whole lives trying to put these papers together that one other person may read if they're
Yeah.
lucky. And that's kind of Logan in a nutshell, really. I mean, he's a more violent sort of mental version of that, but that's what it is. It's kind of like if you're going to look at this as inevitably you will look at Day of the Dead as a microcosm of society, so military, science, academia, and the people on the ground doing the practical stuff. It's a kind of it's an interesting little snapshot of
Yeah.
society and how it really doesn't function, even when there's not a zombie apocalypse.
He's certainly ensconced himself in his own way of thinking. And that's it, isn't it? He's closed himself off in that I'll just focus on this. I can control this and I can pretend to contribute to the situation when he probably does deep down know all I'm doing is proving things, as we said earlier.
And
And as
he,
Sarah
mate, he does not make any friends, does he? I mean,
said,
you could see that there are moments where he could placate Rhodes, but he just
yeah.
decides he's going to wind him up, and it's just like, don't. He's got a gun. Just threaten to kill your mate. Don't wind him up.
But that's that superiority again, isn't it?
Yeah,
The power of the mind over the power of the gun. And you're right, that moment when he silences him with the statistics, where you're going to go, and the 400,000 to one, it's Rhodes is flawed because he's been confronted with a man of logic, or we assume a man of logic, confronted with facts which seem reasonable, and that totally undermines his plan of I've got to get out of here. When in reality, they should all cooperate and stay in that bunker till it all blows over. But it's just not going to blow over.
no, no. Anyway, last quick word on Day of the Dead.
Oh, blimey. I don't know. It's just, I just think it's brilliant. I just think it's brilliant for every reason that we've talked about, really. It's so dense. It's got so much in it. and it's also just very, very good. And it really ends, it properly ends those three films. I don't really know if you needed the other films after it, because
No, well,
they certainly says it's done and dusted now. So if Sarah's dead, the others must be dead. So there's no humanity. If they've escaped, then those last three people are going to have a great time before they die. And that's the end of it. I just think it's a little sad that he didn't cut back to zombies just milling around and really reinforcing that notion that they have taken possession of something they have no need for. And it's like that thing in 28 Days Later, isn't it? They sort of say, well, eventually they'll rot, eventually they'll die, eventually there'll be nothing. They won't be able to bite you. But it'll be too late by then, won't it? Everything is gone. And there's such a celebration of bleakness and a willingness to do that, which we don't see that often in film. So there's just a lot in it. And for me, it's probably Romero's best film in terms of him as someone who wants to communicate a message, him as a director, but also him as someone saying, can we just have some really, really cool special effects and some really gory moments that you're going to scream at and you're going to laugh at. So,
well, it just remains for me to say thank you to James Rose for coming on. Cheers, mate. Lovely to have you on again. And remember to call round next time. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.